remit. There's already that practical input from citizens working with politicians, and so I think that would be helpful. And I suppose just to say, like, you know, from the point of view of our electoral system, because of course we're focusing maybe on shortcomings and the need, but I think one very interesting thing arising out of the Constitutional Convention was really most people were happy with our electoral system in terms of the single transferable vote, the PR system, because we got the opportunity to look at so many other systems, and everybody seemed to be happy, which was sort of, you know, something interesting to note. So that's one good thing there. The other thing is, and in terms of reforming, I mean, there's never been a constitutional convention before, and I do believe we wouldn't have had the referendum on marriage equality if the Constitutional Convention hadn't ratified it and suggested that the opportunity be given to the people to see if people wanted to endorse marriage equality. So to me, that's all pretty reforming and new, and a different approach to bringing forward issues around the Constitution, both procedural and substantive. You know, one thing often strikes me is the irony, maybe not just the irony in Ireland, the irony in Europe, maybe you could call it the Western world. We are real evangelical when it comes to democracy when we go to developing countries. We see the Arab Spring and we're saying, oh, this is wonderful, and they're going to embrace democracy. And we go to Eastern Europe, we go to Russia, we make sure they're doing things fairly. We want to pump money into, for example, the United States pumped a lot of money into Kenya developing a new constitution, or Katiba. And, you know, we all see the value outside our own country. And unfortunately, when it comes to our own country, it seems that the value of our democracy seems to diminish and diminish and diminish. And I suppose, you know, a lot of the reform I would see is, you know, we don't have the town councils now. We were looking to abolish the Senate. We've less number of TDs, and a number of things like that. Now, on the other hand, I think that a lot of that matches people's general feelings about things, maybe not rationally always thought out, in that, you know, the general view is, well, what are politicians doing? What's it all about? Yeah, quangos. It's all these buzzwords when people are feeling irritated anyway because of pressure on them, and it's a backlash to it. And, you know, I wouldn't see an electoral commission done the right way. Definitely wouldn't be a quango, and it could encapsulate a lot of things. I think we have to go back to our citizens again. I mean, are we at a point where, you know, after having the benefits of democracy for so long, and now we can say more than ever in our society, the rights of the individual are valued more than they have ever been in the past. The rights of the individual citizen, the right for me to live my life the way I want to, obviously there are certain parameters, to self-determine, all these sort of things. Are we just more self-centred now and not really so bothered about, well, what do I need to do to keep the overall framework going? And what I mean by this, what struck me very much during the children's referendum, and we all get very outraged about the atrocities of the past and the not so distant past and the things that are going on now, systemic failures and so on. And this referendum was brought forward at least on the premise that we were going to strengthen children's rights, and yet the turnout was so poor. And actually, I also noted myself from going around to the polling stations, which is what I do on the day of a referendum or an election, and I touch base with the people in the polling stations running the voting, and they'll tell you young people didn't turn out, and it was held on a Saturday. You know, so I think there's not just young people, but it's like, what's the relevance? Very often we know a certain socio-economic group don't vote, and yet arguably in terms of our welfare state, often they're the biggest beneficiaries of this. So, you know, I think sometimes we need a reality check to see that, you know, yeah, maybe democracy, when you really get to the stability point, is boring, because it's all about conversation, dialogue, listening to diverse views, ultimately accepting we're not all going to agree on things, no more than the past referendum that took place. Not everybody agrees on things, but respecting that it is about conversation, and not some of what has taken place in this country of late, where we see extreme protests, which to my mind are more akin to intimidation and bullying, and doesn't respect that actually the other person, be they a politician or another grouping, may have a different view to you that can be respected. And I suppose I just want to mention it, and it stands out as a changing time in the whole protest on water, was what happened to the Taoiseach out in Jobstown. I thought it was a disgrace, and the idea that you'd hold on to her for 3 or 4 hours, what was the point? Were you hoping that she was going to change her mind, that she'd be intimidated, that she doesn't have a deep-held conviction about the particular policy she was putting forward? So I think democracy is delicate. It's only as good as we keep working on it, and we constantly strive towards excellence and improving the organs and the instruments and the state. Basically whatever way we can support our democracy. So, sometimes I think it's important that we reflect on that. The other thing about electoral reform is, it's been touched on, I think it was been touched on by Deputy Gaeltacht, electoral reform. We've put it to the people, after the Abbey Lara judgment, we couldn't conduct inquiries in a certain fashion in the Oireachtas. It was put to the people. They said, no, we're not giving you all this power, ye politicians. Fair enough. I believe also that was, notwithstanding the problems that Deputy Maloney pointed out with the ballot paper in the Shannon, I don't think people wanted to give the people in the Dáil all the power either. So, we can look at the mechanics and look at where things could have been done better, but ultimately, whether we think, that was a wise decision for the electorate to make or not, they do, and we respect it and we uphold it through our laws and all the rest. So, to me, an awful lot of it is about how you get people to engage again. And I do believe when we were at the Constitutional Convention and people suggested we reduce not only the voting age, and we also saw we had the referendum to reduce the voting age of the President. Yeah, I believe people suggesting that were really thinking, well, if we reduce the age, we're going to get more engagement. People will see it as more relevant. I don't agree with that. I think there's something else. There's something else to be tackled here in relation to people seeing the correlation between the peace, the stability we enjoy in this country compared to so many other countries, the personal freedoms we have that they don't have anywhere else. And yes, we should have debates, and we're not all going to agree, and that will forever be the way. But we have a vehicle to deal with it. And I definitely think that the Electoral Commission would have a great role to play in this. But I would just, as I say, and have described, I think that there has been an attempt at a lot of reforms, as I have described them. And in many ways, people say they don't want them. But I don't really think that's what's bugging people. What's bugging people is the economic pressures that have been upon them. Of course, they don't want to see any sort of, what would I call it, latricoism or all this sort of stuff that might have been associated with politics. But I just think that maybe we should celebrate our democracy and not be so cynical. There's an awful lot of people out there trying their very best, and whether I agree with somebody on a different political spectrum or not, I respect that they're trying their best too. That sort of conversation needs to be had, and I know that's no question at all, Chairman, but it's just some views haven't been on the Constitutional Convention, and maybe we got a chance, courtesy of Professor Farrell and a number of you there as well, to hear some expertise, professional contributions, and to hear from citizens. But I think we have a lot to celebrate in this country, and maybe we should remember that first and foremost.
Thank you, Deputy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take Deputy Dowds and Deputy McLaughlin together now with their questions as well. Deputy Dowds.
Could I thank all our visitors for turning up, and I apologise because of some of the demands of this place. I had to be out of the room for quite a bit. I very strongly agree with the comments that were being made in relation to the voting register. I mean, there are very, very serious problems there, and pretty well agree with the comments that you have made and that other speakers on this side have made, and I think that alone presents a very good case for having an electoral commission. If I can just make two other points. One that I know Dr. Reedy started off with, that we do need to recognise that we are a strong democracy, that we have a very strong and long tradition of unbroken democracy, and I think there are only 4 or 5 countries in Europe that have that since the time that we became an independent state, and I think it's something that we should cherish, and because it's not something that I think any of us should take for granted. Can I ask as well, I think from what Deputy Maloney said to me that you may have touched on the question of the drawing of electoral boundaries, because as they are drawn at the moment, in some instances, they are really drawn in a ridiculous way. I mean, if you take the area that Deputy McLaughlin represents over there, I mean, the Sligo-Leitrim constituency now is going to have West Cavan and South Donegal all in the same constituency as Enniscrone in the west of Sligo, which is absolutely ridiculous. And I don't think that's, or I could give other examples. There's another good example where part of South Mayo was put into West Galway, which is another bit of lunacy. If it had to be put into Galway, it would have made far more sense to put it in with East Galway, because at least Tuam is nearby, which would be a centre. So I don't know whether you would also be involved in trying to iron out that kind of ridiculous nonsense, which in fact no retired politician, if they were involved, would inflict that on anybody.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of comments, quite a number of them have been raised already, but the first thing would be in relation to, and I raised it previous to this, in relation to abuses with the draft register of electors at the last local elections in my constituency, particularly in the Leitrim end of the constituency. The vast number of people who were registered on the draft register who were actually out of the country, who submitted for voting purposes. We examined those, and I think this is some area that hasn't been mentioned earlier, or certainly since I came in here, and I think it's vitally important that the abuses that are taking place on registers, and I think that would have to be addressed. Mr. Dowd, you mentioned there about bank tellers and that doing the counting. I think we'll keep the bankers out of the elections at this stage or whatever else, because I personally think, my honest opinion is that over the years, and I've seen it at first hand in many elections at local level and at national level, the work being done by the county council staff in the various constituencies have worked extremely hard. They have the experience, they have the know-how, they have the knowledge, and they have been working there for generations. And I think that these are the people, both males and females, that have done an excellent job over the years. Why change something that has been very, very successful? I suppose in the past we certainly had rate collectors who would have known everybody, their ages, and indeed the times that they came to the age of voting. Unfortunately, we don't have a system like that at the present time. But I'm amazed, I heard some of the previous speakers saying nobody leaves my constituency offices without me checking to see if they're, or my staff, to see if they're on the register. And I make no apologies for it, and tell these people, if I'm making representations and helping them and assisting them, I check the register before they leave to know that these people are on the register. I know previous people have spoken in relation to and that is a problem. It's a problem in every constituency, I suppose, in relation to rentals, particularly in built-up areas. It's very, very difficult to certainly to know, and sometimes it's too late. It's certainly, I think, Professor, you mentioned there about the Swedish system. That wouldn't work at all with us. Like if all the voters had voted by postal votes in advance of a 3-week election campaign, because we'd be nearly redundant for that 3 weeks. You know what I mean? I certainly wouldn't appreciate that. So these are just some of the comments that I would like to make. But I think that we had seen the fiasco. I mean, we talked about the electronic voting, which was a fiasco financially and indeed politically in this country. Certainly that we would never, I honestly believe that we'd never go back to again after what has happened in this country. So, Chairman, I'd just like to perhaps maybe get some comments there.
Deputy.
Just to pick up on Deputy McLaughlin's point, in our study in 2008, we certainly recommended that the actual administration of elections should remain at local level, with only supervision by the Electoral Commission for the reasons you mentioned, and also that Dr. Reedy mentioned about the flexibility that's involved, because the one shining light in the electoral system seemed to be the role of the returning officers, which the political parties and others were very pleased with. Their independence, their integrity, the efficiency of their operations. So I don't think anybody advocates changing that particular aspect of the system.
Just to add on to that, in the last couple of months, Professor Farrell and my colleague Fiona Buckley at UCC were involved in the audit of the 2011 election, and again the data that has come back there has been very strong in relation to the impartiality and effectiveness of the staff who are involved in the conduct of polling and the counting of votes, so that it's not seen that there's any difficulty there, and that's why we talk really about consolidating these functions and providing structures and guidance. There are really there are examples of very good practice in this position already.
Thank you.
Professor Farrell.
I just wanted to pick up on one of Deputy Mulhern's comments about how we're very prone in this part of the world to advise new democracies on how to develop and what are good things for new democracies. And one of the telling things when we look at an audit of where independent electoral commissions exist, they're more prominent in the newer democracies. So clearly we're very quick to advise new democracies that they should have independent electoral commissions. We're a bit more slow on this side of the world to try and adopt them ourselves. So I think there's a very good example there of, you know, we can wish it upon others, but perhaps we should start thinking about ourselves.
The point there is that a lot of these new democracies don't look for their inspiration to us in Western Europe or North America. They look to India, because the Indian Electoral Commission has been operating since the early 1950s. And in many ways, the Indian Commission has set the standards for effective. You know, the Indian Commission can ensure that people who live in tin huts by the side of the road are registered to vote and get to vote without any difficulty, which rather puts the problems we have in Ireland in perspective. And introduce electronic voting very successfully too.
They also have elections that last 3 months, because I was there for the 3 months. And if you think 3 weeks is a long time, try 3 months. Just not imposing that, are you? Oh, I would if I could, yeah. More work for academics. But one cautionary note and one aside. We should not see an electoral commission as a panacea for the lack of involvement by many people in politics. The reason people are not involved in politics is, I would suggest, because they don't think it matters. And they only think it matters if who they vote for makes a difference. And if you don't think who you vote for makes a difference, then for many people, why bother? Now, it may be good that it doesn't make a difference. So you've got a choice between two politicians, both of whom are going to do sensible things. Why bother? You know, they're both going to be sensible. If one politician is going to be a disaster and the other is going to be sensible from your point of view, that's the time to vote. Turnout is affected more by whether people think it's worth it. And on the whole, they think it's worth it when politicians are a lot more active. I think we see turnout highest in those areas where politicians probably do most to get involved with the community. We see it in referendums. The pattern of voting in referendums is entirely different from the pattern of voting in elections. And I think it's down to the activities of politicians. So I think it's politicians going to get people out to vote, not an electoral commission. But I think it can do all sorts of good work to facilitate voting. Just as an aside on electronic voting, 2 countries with electoral commissions that I mentioned in my submission, both have electronic voting. Curiously enough, both New Zealand and Scotland use exactly the same electoral system that we do, but they have the sense, maybe advised by their electoral commission, to give people ballot papers that they filled in by hand. They then scanned those ballot papers and counted them electronically. Then you don't need bank tellers, because, well, at least maybe you do. That's how bank tellers deal with our money. So,
Senator Cockeen.
Sorry, I was late. I've had to go to something else. And obviously, it has served us and our democracy fairly well. But enough has been said, I presume, about the electoral register, because we've been speaking about it ad infinitum, and you don't want to hear it from me again about what's wrong with it. There's a lot right with it, but there's a lot to be done with it. And I think accuracy is the best. Now, on the setting up of the commission and an independent commission, I think that is the word that we need a definition of. We have to ensure that everybody is independent, and what does independence mean. Also, political scientists vary, and I think a word that Professor Marsh mentioned there, you know, from your point of view, depending on what politician you choose, from your point of view, you get the result, you know, or from your point of view as political scientists, depending on where you're coming from. And so we have to ensure that at the outset that obviously political scientists are independent, but very often what happens too with science is particularly in an electoral register, if you're drawing boundaries, that the people go out the window and the signs comes in the door, and you have splitting of parishes right down the middle, and you don't get the result, maybe the best result for the people. You get the best result numerically. You get the best result to serve the population versus the amount of TDs. But on the ground, it may not be the best. And I think that has to be a huge consideration in anybody and any commission and any looking at any electoral register. But because it hasn't been, I think, in the past, and I think I'd say an awful lot has probably been said on that as well, on the way the different boundaries are. And again, and you mentioned there about people on the register and how important is it to people to vote. And Professor Marsh was speaking about it there. And in some countries, there's a penalty for not voting. That's a thing that, again, that has to be looked at because, again, if it makes people think about it. Why bother? Might be one thing. Why not bother if it is important to everybody else in the country, you know, as well, that people should go out and vote? Is it important to vote? I do think it is important to vote. And everybody has a point of view. Everybody has a valuable point of view, depending on where you're coming from. And some people may think it's not worth their while, but in actual fact, at the end of the day, it should be worth their while. And if they make it worth their while by voting, that's when everybody will sit up and listen. So I think that point should be put across as well. I won't delay, because I said an awful lot has been said on it. Just the time scale and whatever else and down the road. Electronic voting, I know I was at City West when it happened, and when the buttons were pressed, and when a certain deputy was standing there and didn't get the seat, you know, and it's an awful shock to the system. And if there's a paper trail, in the last voting system there wasn't, and the system, the way it worked, was absolutely mad, and the whole countdown and the back trail wasn't, you know, it wasn't obvious. If you had a system where you have the actual same system electronically, it would be much faster, much more efficient, and I can see why it wouldn't work. It's just that it has a bad name now, and I don't know if we will ever. It's very hard to correct a mistake when it's done like that, and it's probably ingrained in the psyche now that electronic voting is bad. As somebody said, it takes the fun out of it as well. But it's of course we need fun in our lives, but serious voting is serious business, as we all. The tallymen as well, yeah, and women, and that you know, again, I think one of the topics as well that you're dealing with about the quota and women in politics and all that. So, look, thank you for attending, and I'm sorry I was late for the presentation. I know I have them online here. I've read some of them and most of them indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Keane. Can I just augment that with a question to the panellists? Just in relation to the whole issue of the electoral register. Now, bear in mind we're going to have weeks of hearings, and we will have, you know, franchise people and local authority people in to discuss that issue. But in your own opinions, what's the best, again, in terms of the international model, what's the one we should aspire to? And is there a way of enhancing the status quo without completely departing it? Because my experience, for example, in Cork South West is that we've had a very conscientious franchise operation. There seldom is an issue, seldom is a controversy. And we've had a situation whereby local authority people, ex-rate collectors for example, even in retirement, were still temporary franchise people, and were very good at unscientifically adding people to the register. And that's a very big human resource, and we've been lucky, and I accept that's not the case in other areas. So just in terms of the electoral register, what's the best possible practice? I remember Foreign Minister Dick Rhodes tried to confront this issue a number of years ago, and it just backfired as Minister. It really was, you know, I think not least because of the amount of individual local authorities involved in it, and the inconsistency in the approach was very difficult to find a single one solution to that. So in your own expert opinion, what's the best system that we should aspire to?
Well, I can begin by saying that I don't have an expert view on how to compile an electoral register, because it's not something I've done a systematic study on. And, you know, I know it's repeating what we've said before, is one of the things an electoral commission could do is to pursue its own research and commission research on that particular question.
Okay.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I would tend to agree exactly with that. That's what I was trying to say, perhaps not very coherently earlier on. That, one of the risks that your process, I think, runs is if you go too much into the detail of how to do X, how to do Y. And Senator Keane was raising a few points there, for example. There's a risk that the big objective is missed, which is an electoral commission needs to be established. And when it is established, it should be given a remit to try and explore issues like this.
I could just suggest to the committee, I mean, it wouldn't be a huge burden, financial or otherwise, to perhaps hear about the cross-border experience. Certainly my experience of living there and voting there is very different, and obviously we all know the background to the kind of tightening up of the electoral system in the north, but possibly you could get an official from the equivalent of franchise section in the devolved Department of Environment in Belfast to come and speak to you just about how they manage it, because it's a very...
You've never voted 12 times, as one person told me he had in Belfast.
No, but I'm sure that from my student days in Dublin, I'm sure I have ballot papers floating around somewhere there, but no, in Belfast it's very heavily regulated.
That was an important part of our study in 2008, talking to George Bain in relation to the experience in Northern Ireland, which isn't perfect by any means. But it did strike us in compiling the 2008 study that Northern Ireland would be the logical place to start. And that the broad principle which they use there of a single nationwide register which tries to track the identity of the individual and uses not just national insurance numbers but all kinds of other information from drivers, registration, etc. What you've got to do is try and triangulate on the identity of the individual using a variety of sources rather than relying on any one particular measure indeed. So it struck us that rather than trying to invent a totally new system, it would be sensible to look at for the Commission certainly to look at the Northern Ireland system as the basis for a system to operate down here.
Yeah, Dr. Reedy.
I would just add that I think a lot of some of the issues that have come up earlier kind of fall into the broader category of electoral policy, and electoral policy would remain in the remit of the government and the Parliament, the electoral system and major questions of when elections occur. What might be interesting to tease out in a little bit more detail is the kind of intersection between broad questions of electoral policy and certain technical elements of how elections are conducted vis-a-vis the electoral system, the electoral registration system, or things like electronic voting, how far it's the role of the Electoral Commission to recommend policy, and within what areas do they actually have scope to introduce policy themselves. So in terms of thinking about the Electoral Commission, rather than specifically thinking about each individual area, to think about where that space occurs, where broad election policy meets quite technical election issues, and who is responsible for what. Because one of the kind of issues that keeps coming up is all kinds of new electoral things occur and we are waiting on legislation, so the internet, social media. In what space does the Electoral Commission have the capacity to respond to these types of things, and in what space are you relying on the Parliament to actually set the major groundwork or framework within which decisions could be taken?
One interesting detail we picked up about the Northern system was one way that 16 and 17-year-olds are sold in the idea of registering to vote is that the voter registration card is a very cheap form of age identification, which they use for what young people use age identification for.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, that brings us to a conclusion. I want to thank all of our witnesses for our first consideration of this very, very important topic. I know I found the exchanges quite fascinating, quite interesting, and sometimes I think in the question there might even be some solutions or some answers. I want to thank Professor Marsh, Professor Farrell, Dr. McCorry, Dr. Reedy and Mr. O'Dowd. Thank you very much indeed for your interaction. It is much appreciated. You are now free to go. No, we weren't holding you here against your will. Okay, we're going to suspend the meeting until 4:35. We're back in private session.